Welcome to the Explainer, everyone. If you've ever signed an apartment lease, bought a new vehicle, or honestly, even just agreed to buy a buddy's old bicycle, you have stepped into the incredibly intricate world of contracts. Today, we are unpacking the Indian Contract Act of 1872, and I promise you, it's not just some dusty, boring piece of legislation. It is literally the ultimate blueprint for how everyday deals are made legally binding. By the end of this, you are going to look at every casual promise and handshake in a completely different light. Let's dive in. So, here's our roadmap for today. We'll kick things off with a journey to the 1872 Act, break down the anatomy of a contract, look at the precise ingredients of a valid deal, cover the rules of engagement, and then finish up with what happens when deals go wrong.
Okay, Section 1, Journey to the 1872 Act. It's actually pretty wild to trace how the whole concept of an agreement shifted across completely different historical eras. See, long before 1872, there was no single, unified law for contracts. In ancient times, people leaned on Hindu law sources like the Vedas and Smritis. In fact, ancient texts like the Narada Smriti had super specific rules, even stating someone was only competent to enter a contract after age 16. Then, moving into the Mauryan era, we start seeing bilateral transactions built on free consent. Fast forward to the Mughal period, and deals were governed by Mohammedan law. They used the Arabic word aqd, which means a conjunction, along with ajab for a proposal and qabul for acceptance. Eventually, the British brought English law to the presidency towns via the Charter of 1726, and that laid the absolute groundwork for the formal Indian Contract Act, which finally came into force on September 1, 1872.
Moving right along to Section 2, Anatomy of a Contract.
When you look at a formally signed document, you know it's not just ink and paper. It is a carefully engineered set of legal obligations. It restricts what you can do and creates very specific rights and duties between everyone involved. But how exactly do we get to that formal stage? Well, let's look at our first major term, which is defined in Section 2E of the Act. It basically tells us that an agreement is a mutual exchange of promises. One person makes a proposal, the other gives their thumbs up, their assent, and boom, it becomes a promise. So an agreement is simply an accepted proposal involving mutual consideration. But here is the critical trap that trips a lot of people up. Section 2H states that a contract is an agreement that is enforceable by law. That means all contracts are agreements, but absolutely not all agreements are contracts. Agreement is a much broader term. If a court of law won't actually back it up, it's just an agreement, not a contract.
So, it's basically a two-step math problem for lawyers. Step 1, you add an offer and an acceptance together to get your agreement. Step 2, then and only then, you must add legal enforceability to finally get your contract.
Let's put this into perspective with a really stark contrast. Think about a standard domestic promise. A father promises his son a 500 rupee monthly pocket allowance. Now, if dad forgets or just refuses to pay, the son can't exactly drag his father to a court of law, right? Because social agreements simply do not have the intention to create legal relations. But on the flip side, if A agrees to sell a car to B for 2 lakhs, that is a strict commercial transaction. It absolutely intends to create a legal obligation, which is exactly what makes it a legally enforceable contract.
All right, Section 3, Ingredients of a Valid Deal. Think of Section 10 of the Act as your absolute must-have recipe checklist. Every valid deal has to check off these specific boxes. First, you need at least 2 distinct parties because you obviously can't make a contract with yourself. You need that intention to create legal relations we just talked about. You need free consent, meaning nobody is being bullied or tricked. You also need competency, lawful consideration, and whatever you're agreeing to must actually be possible to perform. If you are missing even a single one of these ingredients, your contract is completely dead in the water. Zooming in on that competency ingredient for a second, Section 11 is super strict. To even have the legal capacity to make a deal, you must be a legal adult of at least 18 years of age. Minors simply cannot enter into valid contracts. You've also got to be of sound mind, meaning you are fully in your senses and understand the weight of what you're signing. And lastly, you can't be disqualified by your legal status. For instance, an alien enemy or a convict cannot just casually sign business contracts.
Moving right along to Section 4, Rules of Engagement.
So, a huge takeaway here is that vagueness is basically kryptonite to a contract. Imagine A agrees to sell B 100 tons of oil. Sounds like a massive lucrative deal, right? But the law says this is completely invalid. Why? Because it doesn't specify what kind of oil. Are we talking olive oil, motor oil, Coconut oil? If the agreement isn't crystal clear, the courts literally cannot enforce it. Certainty of meaning is non-negotiable.
I absolutely love this delightfully absurd example that comes straight from the source text. A agrees with B to discover treasure by magic. Look, the law operates in the real world, not in a fantasy novel. Because discovering hidden treasure by magic is scientifically and practically impossible, the agreement is completely unenforceable. The terms have to be physically and legally capable of actually happening.
Furthermore, your object and your consideration must be entirely lawful. Section 23 doesn't mess around here. You cannot use the power of contract law to bypass the criminal justice system. For example, if you promise to drop a robbery prosecution against the guy if he just returns your stolen stuff, that is void right out of the gate because the object is unlawful. And it probably goes without saying, but you absolutely cannot trade a piece of real estate for 100 kilograms of cocaine. Any agreement with an unlawful or illegal consideration is void, period.
And finally, Section 5, when deals go wrong.
Let's untangle a massive legal distinction that confuses a lot of folks: void versus voidable. A void contract is one that started out valid but simply ceases to be enforceable because of uncontrollable events. Say you contract to buy 10 tons of sugar from a specific factory, but the night before delivery the factory tragically burns to the ground. The performance is now totally impossible, so the contract becomes void. A voidable contract, on the other hand, means one party was wronged. Like if A held a gun to B's head and threatened to shoot him unless B gave him a loan. B obviously gave the loan under extreme coercion. The law steps in and says this contract is enforceable entirely at the option of the victim. B holds the power to cancel it, making it voidable.
We have journeyed all the way from ancient Smritis and Mughal Ahd through the strict checklist of Section 10 to the absolute crucial differences between void and voidable contracts. Now that you know the anatomy, the exact ingredients, and the strict rules of the Indian Contract Act of 1872, I want to leave you with this to ponder. The next time you make a casual promise or shake hands on a deal, have you actually just created a legally binding obligation? Or is it just another unenforceable agreement? Definitely keep these lessons in mind before you say, "I promise." Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.